You just picked the wrong guy for what you want.
Did I?
Yeah, I'm not on the market.
I wasn't shopping.
Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, quite a couple. Central casting for legends of American film.
Those blue eyes could sell anything. Rebellion, charm, danger, hope. Paul Newman became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, playing men who refused to break. But behind the fame was a man who lost his only son, turned salad dressing into $600 million for charity, and stayed married for 50 years in a town where marriages rarely last 5. This is the unknown life of Paul Newman from Cool Hand Luke. The boy from Shaker Heights. Paul Leonard Newman was born on January 26, 1925, in Cleveland, Ohio. Not in Hollywood, not in New York. In the suburbs of Cleveland, in a neighborhood called Shaker Heights, where his father Arthur ran a sporting goods store called Newman Stern, and his mother Teresa loved the theater. The Newman family lived comfortably, though not lavishly. Arthur Newman was a practical man, a businessman who understood the value of hard work. He'd built the sporting goods business from the ground up, serving the Cleveland community with quality equipment and reliable service. Teresa, on the other hand, had artistic sensibilities. She loved plays, loved performances, loved the magic of theater. These two different temperaments would shape young Paul in ways neither parent could have predicted. Paul wasn't destined for stardom. There was nothing about young Paul Newman that screamed future movie star. He was a regular kid in a regular Ohio town, growing up with his older brother Arthur Jr., going to school, playing around the neighborhood. His mother took him to plays at the Cleveland Playhouse, exposed him to theater, but he wasn't stage struck. Not yet. He saw acting as something interesting, maybe, but not as a career. You didn't grow up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, in the 1930s dreaming of Hollywood. At age 10, he performed in a school production of St. George and the Dragon at the Cleveland Playhouse. His mother was in the audience, proud, encouraging, seeing something in her younger son that maybe he didn't see in himself yet. But Paul didn't see acting as his future. He saw it as something you did in school, like any other activity. Sports interested him more. He liked football, liked being part of a team. The relationship between Paul and his father was complicated. Arthur Newman was successful but distant, the kind of father who provided for his family but didn't necessarily connect emotionally. Years later, in his posthumous memoir, Paul would talk about feeling he was never quite enough for his father, never quite measuring up to some invisible standard. His mother, meanwhile, loved him unconditionally, which created its own problems. If nothing he did could disappoint her, did anything he did matter? When Paul graduated from high school in 1943, the country was deep into World War II. Like so many young men of his generation, he enlisted. He wanted to be a pilot. He had dreams of flying, of soaring above the clouds, of being part of the action in the skies over Europe or the Pacific. Flying represented freedom, adventure, escape from the ordinary world of Cleveland and sporting goods stores. But during his physical examination at the recruitment center, they discovered something. Paul Newman was colorblind. He couldn't distinguish certain colors, particularly red and green. Couldn't be a pilot if you couldn't tell the difference between the lights on your instrument panel. That dream died before it started, right there in the examination room. So instead of flying planes, he became a radio operator in the Navy. He served in the Pacific Theater, aboard ships, listening to communications, relaying messages. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he'd imagined, but he did his duty. Served his country, saw parts of the world he'd never imagined. The Pacific during wartime, the heat, the fear, the boredom between moments of terror. It changed him, like it changed everyone who served. When he came home in 1946, he was 21 years old and had no idea what to do with his life. He enrolled at Kenyon College in Ohio on an athletic scholarship, played football, partied, did what college kids do, drank beer with his fraternity brothers, went to dances, tried to figure out who he was supposed to be, but then something happened that would change everything. He got into trouble. Got drunk one night, got thrown in jail, got kicked off the football team for his behavior. Suddenly, he needed something else. He needed another path. And that's when he found acting. Really found it. Not as a school activity, but as something that might be a career. He started taking theater courses, performing in college productions. He discovered he was good at it. Better than good. When he was on stage, something clicked. He could be someone else, explore emotions, connect with an audience. People noticed him, not just because of those blue eyes, but because he could actually act. His theater professor at Kenyon encouraged him. Here was a young man with natural talent, with presence, with something special. Maybe, just maybe, he could make a go of it professionally. It wasn't a sure thing. Most people who tried to make it in theater failed, but wasn't it worth trying? The first marriage and the move to New York. In 1949, Paul Newman graduated from Kenyon College with a degree in drama. That same summer, he was doing summer stock theater in Wisconsin at the Williams Bay Playhouse, learning his craft, honing his skills. Summer stock was where young actors went to get experience, performing in a different play every week or two, learning to work fast, to adapt, to perform under pressure. It was there that he met a young actress named Jacqueline Vitt. Everyone called her Jackie. She was pretty, talented, ambitious. They were both young people trying to make it in theater, sharing the same dreams, the same struggles. Romance blossomed quickly, the way it does when you're young and working intensely together on something you both love. Paul and Jackie married in December 1949. He was 24, she was 19, and they were starting their lives together with hope and optimism. Marriage seemed like the right thing to do. They were in love, they had plans, they believed in a future together. The following year, 1950, brought both joy and tragedy. Their first child was born, a son they named Alan Scott Newman, though everyone would call him Scott. But that same year, Paul's father Arthur died. He was only in his 50s, struck down by a heart attack, gone too soon. Paul had to go back to Cleveland, had to help run the family's sporting goods store. For a while, it looked like he might give up acting altogether, might settle into the life of a Cleveland businessman. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't spend his life selling baseball bats and tennis rackets when he'd found something he loved, something that made him feel alive. After about a year of trying to make it work, after realizing he'd be miserable if he stayed, he made a decision. He was going to New York. He was going to study acting seriously. He was going to see if he could make it. Jackie supported him, or at least accepted it. What choice did she have? They moved to New York with their infant son, settling into a small apartment, scraping by on whatever money Paul could earn doing odd jobs while he studied. By this time, Jackie had mostly given up her own acting ambitions to focus on being a mother. Someone had to take care of Scott while Paul pursued his dreams. 2 more children followed. Susan was born in 1953, then Stephanie in 1954. 3 children under the age of 5. Jackie was home with them in their apartment while Paul attended the prestigious Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg. The Actors Studio was where the best went to learn. Marlon Brando had studied there, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, all the great method actors of the generation, actors who dug deep into their emotions, who lived their roles, who brought psychological depth to their performances. Newman threw himself into it, studied intensely, learned to access his own emotions, to find truth in his performances. He was talented, everyone could see that, but New York was full of talented actors. The question was whether he'd get his break. In 1953, while Jackie was pregnant with Susan, Paul got cast in a Broadway production of Picnic. It was written by William Inge, directed by Joshua Logan, and it was a major production. Paul's role wasn't huge. He was a supporting player, sometimes even filled in for the male lead, but it was Broadway. Real Broadway. The show was a hit, ran for over a year, and Paul Newman was part of it. And it was there, in the rehearsal rooms and backstage areas of that production, that he met someone who would change his life. Her name was Joanne Woodward. Joanne Woodward and the affair that changed everything. Joanne Woodward was an understudy in Picnic. She was from Thomasville, Georgia, sophisticated, independent, already making a name for herself in television and theater. She had that Southern charm combined with a sharp intelligence and fierce independence. When Paul Newman first saw her, he was dazzled, absolutely captivated. She, on the other hand, was less impressed. Years later, she'd say he looked like an ice cream soda ad, and she thought it was disgusting. Too pretty, too perfect, too conventional, too much the all-American boy. But Paul was determined. He wasn't as dull as he looked, and he set out to prove it. They were both at the Actors Studio, both serious about their craft, both ambitious. They started talking, spending time together, discovering they had chemistry both on and off stage. Eventually, the attraction became mutual, undeniable. There was just one problem. Paul Newman was married. He had a wife at home with 3 small children. He had responsibilities, commitments, a family depending on him. What followed was a 4-year affair. Paul and Joanne, drawn to each other, unable to stay apart, meeting whenever they could while Paul went home to Jackie and the kids. It wasn't something Paul was proud of. In fact, in his memoir published after his death, he talked about his guilt, his shame, his understanding of how much he hurt Jackie and the children during those years. Jackie knew, of course. Wives always know. She was home taking care of Scott, Susan, and Stephanie, while Paul was supposedly studying, or auditioning, or rehearsing. But he wasn't always where he said he was. The betrayal hurt her deeply, but she stayed. For the children, for the hope that it would pass, for all the reasons people stay in difficult marriages. Meanwhile, Paul's career was starting to take off. After Picnic closed, he started getting work in television. The mid-1950s were the golden age of live television drama, and Paul appeared in shows like the Philco Television Playhouse, Goodyear Television Playhouse, and the United States Steel Hour. He was learning his craft, getting experience, building a reputation. In 1954, Warner Brothers signed him to a movie contract and brought him to Hollywood for his first film, The Silver Chalice. It was a biblical epic, the kind of overwrought costume drama that Hollywood churned out in those days. Paul played a Greek sculptor who creates the silver chalice used at the Last Supper. He wore a tunic and sandals and looked uncomfortable the entire time. The movie was terrible. Paul knew it was terrible. Critics knew it was terrible. When it aired on television years later, Paul took out newspaper ads apologizing for his performance and urging people not to watch it. But at least he was working in movies now. At least he had a contract. In 1956, everything changed. Paul was cast in Somebody Up There Likes Me, playing boxer Rocky Graziano. The role had originally been slated for James Dean, but Dean died in a car accident before filming began. Paul got the part and made it his own. His performance was raw, emotional, powerful. This wasn't pretty boy acting. This was real. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. Suddenly, Paul Newman wasn't just another handsome face trying to make it in Hollywood. He was an actor, a real actor who could carry a film. In 1957, Paul and Joanne were cast together in The Long Hot Summer, directed by Martin Ritt and based on stories by William Faulkner. It was a film about passion, desire, and heat. The steamy South where emotions ran high and secrets festered. The chemistry between Paul and Joanne wasn't just acting. It was real, and it practically burned through the screen. During filming, Paul made his decision. He couldn't keep living this double life. He couldn't keep lying to Jackie, couldn't keep pretending. He asked for a divorce. Jackie, exhausted from years of being second to Paul's career and his affair, agreed. The divorce was finalized in 1958, though by then, Jackie had just given birth to their third child, Stephanie. The timing was terrible, the pain immense. Paul's 3 children from his first marriage, Scott, Susan, and Stephanie, would grow up feeling the effects of their father's choices, the divorce, the new family, the sense that they'd been left behind for something more exciting, more glamorous. It would haunt Paul for the rest of his life, especially after what happened with Scott years later. On January 29, 1958, just weeks after the divorce was finalized, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward got married in Las Vegas. He was 32, she was 27, and they were beginning what would become one of Hollywood's most legendary marriages. But it began in pain, in the wreckage of his first family, in choices that couldn't be undone. Cool Hand Luke and the rise to superstardom. Paul Newman's film career had started in the mid-1950s. His first movie, The Silver Chalice in 1954, was so bad that years later he took out newspaper ads apologizing for it and asking people not to watch when it aired on television. But he recovered. In 1956, he played boxer Rocky Graziano in Somebody Up There Likes Me, and suddenly, people noticed. This guy could act. The late 1950s and 1960s brought role after role, each one building his reputation. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1958, playing Brick opposite Elizabeth Taylor's Maggie, his first Oscar nomination. The film adaptation of Tennessee Williams' play about secrets, lies, and the things families don't talk about. Newman played a man wrestling with his own identity, his own demons, and he did it with a depth that surprised critics who dismissed him as just another pretty face. The Hustler in 1961 was a turning point. Playing Fast Eddie Felson, the pool shark who hustles his way through life, Newman created a character who was charming and ruthless, talented and self-destructive. Fast Eddie wanted to be the best, wanted to beat Minnesota Fats, wanted to prove something, but he didn't know what he was really after until he'd lost everything getting there. The performance earned Newman his second Oscar nomination. HUD in 1963 pushed even further into anti-hero territory, playing an arrogant, womanizing cowboy in Texas, a man with what the movie posters characters called the barbed wire soul, Newman made audiences sympathize with someone they should have hated. HUD treated people terribly, lied, cheated, destroyed everything good around him, but Newman found the humanity in him, the hurt underneath the cruelty. Third Oscar nomination. But it was 1967's Cool Hand Luke that gave Paul Newman the role he'd be remembered for. Luke Jackson, a prisoner in a southern chain gang who refuses to conform, who keeps fighting the system no matter how hard they beat him down. Luke, with his easy smile and his hard eyes, saying he's got nothing and nothing to lose. The film was directed by Stuart Rosenberg and based on a novel by Don Pierce, who'd actually served time on a chain gang. The authenticity showed, the heat, the exhaustion, the brutal monotony of prison labor. The guards called the boss, watching from behind sunglasses. The other prisoners, each with their own reasons for being there. And Luke, who commits small acts of rebellion just because he can. There's a scene where Luke eats 50 hard-boiled eggs on a bet. 50 eggs in 1 hour. The other prisoners cheer him on, treat it like a religious experience. Luke becomes their hero, their symbol of resistance, just by refusing to quit. It's absurd and moving at the same time, which is the genius of the film. The movie made Newman a counterculture icon. This was 1967, when young people were questioning authority, protesting the war, challenging everything their parents believed. Here was this prisoner, this criminal, and audiences were cheering for him, because Luke represented something people wanted to believe in. The individual who wouldn't break, the rebel who kept standing up even when staying down would be easier. Newman earned his 4th Oscar nomination for Cool Hand Luke. Once again, he didn't win. It was becoming a pattern. Great performances, nominations, no wins. Some actors win early and often. Others wait their whole careers. Newman was becoming the latter, the perennial nominee who everyone agreed was brilliant but somehow never walked away with the statue. But the film cemented his status as one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Along with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969 and The Sting in 1973, Cool Hand Luke defined Newman for a generation. He was the charming rebel, the guy who played by his own rules, the anti-hero you couldn't help but root for. Then came 1969 and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Newman played Butch opposite Robert Redford's Sundance, and the chemistry between them was electric. These were two bank robbers in the Old West, anachronisms even in their own time, refusing to accept that their way of life was ending. The film was funny, melancholic, violent, and tender. It was a massive hit, one of the highest grossing films of the year. Newman and Redford reunited for The Sting in 1973, another huge success. They played con men in 1930s Chicago, running an elaborate scheme against a mob boss. The film won Best Picture, and Newman was at the peak of his career, one of the most bankable stars in the world. But fame came with a price, and for Paul Newman, that price would be paid by his son. The death of Scott Newman. Scott Newman was Paul's oldest child, his only son from his first marriage. Born in 1950, Scott grew up watching his father become famous, watching his father leave his mother, watching his father start a new family with Joanne Woodward. Paul and Joanne had 3 daughters together, Nell, Melissa, and Clea. Paul tried to be a good father to all 6 of his children, but by all accounts, including his own, he was often absent, distant, more focused on his career and his new family than on the 3 children from his first marriage. Scott felt the distance. He struggled with it. Here was his father, this famous actor everyone loved, and Scott was on the outside looking in. He tried acting himself, appeared in a few films including The Towering Inferno, tried to forge his own path. But he was Paul Newman's son, and that shadow was long. Scott started drinking, then drugs. He was fighting demons his father didn't fully understand, or didn't know how to help with. On November 20th, 1978, Scott Newman died of an accidental drug overdose. He was 28 years old. The death devastated Paul. In his memoir, he wrote about his guilt, his regret, his sense that he'd failed his son. "I kept thinking he was going through a phase of adolescent bad judgment," Newman wrote. "I never thought it would be fatal." Scott's death changed Paul Newman. It shifted his priorities, made him think about legacy in a different way. What did success mean if you lost your child? What did fame matter if you couldn't protect the people you loved? In 1980, Paul established the Scott Newman Center, dedicated to drug abuse prevention and education. It was his way of trying to make meaning from tragedy, trying to help other families avoid what his had gone through. The center operated for decades before eventually closing in 2013, but its mission lived on in other charitable work Newman would do. Newman's Own, The Accidental Empire of Charity. In 1980, around Christmas time, Paul Newman was in his barn in Westport, Connecticut, making homemade salad dressing. He'd been making his own dressing for years, using olive oil, vinegar, various spices, mixing it in batches, and giving it to friends as gifts. His neighbor and friend, the writer A.E. Hotchner, came over to help. They mixed the dressing in big batches, bottled it in empty wine bottles. Newman even used his canoe paddle to stir it when they couldn't find anything else. People loved it. Friends kept asking for more. Hotchner suggested they should sell it. Newman thought it was crazy at first. Put his face on a salad dressing bottle? But then they thought about it differently. What if they sold it and gave all the money away? What if they turned commercial exploitation into something good? In 1982, Newman's Own officially launched. That first year, they made over $300,000 in profit. Newman looked at that number and said, "Let's give it all away to those who need it." And they did. 100% of the profits went to charity. The company grew. From salad dressing to pasta sauce to popcorn to lemonade to frozen pizza. Newman's face on every label, sometimes in costumes, always with that slight smile. The labels had jokes, self-deprecating humor. Fine foods. Since February, the first bottle proclaimed. Joanne contributed too. The lemonade recipe came from her family in Georgia, passed down through generations. Their daughter Nell started Newman's Own Organics, featuring both of them dressed like the couple in Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. Year after year, the profits went to charity. By 2008, when Paul Newman died, over $250 million had been donated. Today, that number has surpassed $600 million. $600 million from selling salad dressing and pasta sauce. Newman never took a penny for himself. He was already wealthy from his acting career. He didn't need the money. What he wanted was to do something that mattered, something that helped people. The Hole in the Wall Gang Camp. In 1988, Paul Newman opened the Hole in the Wall Gang Camp in Connecticut. The name came from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But this gang was different. This was a camp for children with serious illnesses. Kids with cancer, kids with blood disorders, kids fighting battles no child should have to fight. The camp gave them a place to just be kids, forget for a while that they were sick. The camp was funded by profits from Newman's Own. Paul was involved personally, visiting the camp, meeting the kids, being part of it. It wasn't just a check he wrote, it was something he cared about deeply, especially after losing Scott. The model worked so well that it expanded. Today, there's a network of camps around the world called Serious Fun Children's Network, all providing seriously ill children a chance to experience joy and normalcy in the midst of their battles. This was Newman's legacy growing, spreading beyond him, beyond his lifetime. It started with grief over his son, evolved into salad dressing for friends, and became a network of camps helping thousands of children around the world. Racing cars and finally winning the Oscar. Most people don't know that Paul Newman was an accomplished race car driver. He discovered racing while filming Winning in 1969 and fell in love with it. The speed, the precision, the danger, the competition, it spoke to something deep in him that acting couldn't quite reach. He wasn't just a celebrity who dabbled. He was serious. He raced professionally, competed in major events like the 24 Hours of Le Mans and the 24 Hours of Daytona, won national championships. 4 national championships, in fact, in Sports Car Club of America competition. At age 70, he became the oldest driver to be part of a winning team at the 24 Hours of Daytona, still competing at an age when most men had long since retired. Racing gave him something acting couldn't. Anonymity in a helmet. Nobody knew or cared who Paul Newman was when he was behind the wheel. Competition based purely on skill, on reaction time, on nerve. A team that treated him like a driver, not like Paul Newman the movie star. It was an escape, a passion, a part of his life separate from Hollywood and all its complications. And speaking of Hollywood, there was still the matter of the Oscar. By the mid-1980s, Newman had been nominated 8 times. 8 times he'd been recognized as one of the best performances of the year. 8 times he'd gone home without the statue. It had become almost a joke. The greatest actor who couldn't win an Oscar. In 1986, he reprised his role as Fast Eddie Felson in The Color of Money, directed by Martin Scorsese. It had been 25 years since The Hustler. Fast Eddie was older now, wiser, sadder, mentoring a young hotshot played by Tom Cruise. Newman's performance was layered, nuanced, drawing on his own experience of aging, of looking back at choices made and roads not taken. Finally, after 8 nominations spanning nearly 3 decades, Paul Newman won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 61 years old. In his acceptance speech, he was gracious, humble, acknowledging how long the journey had been. The Oscar wasn't the most important thing in his life anymore. By then, he had his charity work, his racing, his family, but it was validation, recognition that his craft, the thing he'd discovered in college after getting kicked off the football team, had been worth pursuing. 50 years with Joanne. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward stayed married for 50 years. In Hollywood, where marriages implode regularly, they stayed together. From 1958 until Paul's death in 2008, they were husband and wife. It wasn't perfect. They admitted that publicly. The marriage had rough patches. There were rumors of infidelity in the late 1960s when Paul was at the height of his fame, and Joanne's career had stalled. They nearly broke up. Flew to England to work through it. The death of Scott in 1978 was devastating for both of them. Grief can destroy a marriage or bind it tighter. For them, it seemed to do both before they found their way through. But they stayed. They raised their 3 daughters in Westport, Connecticut, far from the Hollywood lifestyle. They worked together on films, with Paul directing Joanne and Rachel in 1968, The Effect of Gamma Rays on Man in the Moon Marigolds in 1972, and The Glass Menagerie in 1987. When asked about his fidelity, Paul famously said, "Why go out for hamburger when you have steak at home?" It was a good line, but the truth was more complicated and more real than any soundbite. Their daughter Melissa later said there was tension in the house sometimes, that it wasn't all ice cream and cake. But what marriage is. What matters is they chose each other, day after day, for half a century. Actor Liev Schreiber once shared a story about working with them on Twilight when Paul was in his 70s. Joanne came to the set, and Paul said to Schreiber, "Will you look at the ass on her?" Schreiber said it struck him as the ideal relationship. That was the secret maybe. Not perfection, not a fairy tale. Just 2 people who kept choosing each other, who built a life together that was more important than any individual moment. The final years. In June 2008, news leaked that Paul Newman had lung cancer. He'd been a heavy smoker for years, and now, at 83, it had caught up with him. He was receiving treatment at Sloan Kettering in New York City, but the prognosis wasn't good. Newman kept working for as long as he could. His last major film role was in 2002's Road to Perdition, playing a chilling mob patriarch. His last work was voicing Doc Hudson in the 2006 animated film Cars. By 2008, he was too sick to continue. On September 26, 2008, Paul Newman died at his home in Westport, Connecticut. He was 83 years old. Joanne was with him. His daughters were with him. He died surrounded by family, in the home they'd built together, in the town they'd chosen instead of Hollywood. The tributes poured in from everywhere. Fellow actors, directors, people whose lives had been touched by his charity work. But the family kept the funeral private. No media spectacle, no cameras, just family and close friends saying goodbye. Paul Newman left behind a complicated legacy, an extraordinary actor who took years to win an Oscar, a father who lost his only son and spent decades trying to make amends through charity, a husband who stayed married for 50 years despite temptations and troubles, a businessman who accidentally built a food empire that gave away over $500 million. The legacy beyond the screen. Today, Newman's Own continues. The products are still in supermarkets. The profits still go to charity. Over $600 million donated since 1982. The foundation that bears his name continues funding causes he cared about. Children with serious illnesses, nutrition programs, supporting underserved communities. The camps continue too. Kids with cancer still get to go horseback riding and swimming through Serious Fun Children's Network. Still get to forget for a week that they're fighting for their lives. The Scott Newman Center may have closed, but the mission of preventing drug abuse lives on in other programs the foundation supports. Joanne Woodward lived in their Westport home for years after Paul's death. She's in her 90s now, dealing with Alzheimer's disease. Their daughters look after her, just as she once looked after all of them, including Paul's children from his first marriage. In 2022, a posthumous memoir was published, Paul Newman, The Extraordinary Life of an Ordinary Man. Based on interviews Newman did in the 1980s and early 1990s, it revealed the doubts, insecurities, and pain behind the famous blue eyes, the guilt about his first marriage, the devastation over Scott's death, the feeling that he was never quite as good as Marlon Brando or James Dean. That's the thing people forget about movie stars. They're human. They carry the same burdens, make the same mistakes, feel the same regrets. Paul Newman just happened to do it while being one of the most beautiful and talented actors of his generation. But he was more than that. He was a guy who turned salad dressing into charity, a race car driver who competed into his 70s, a husband who stayed when it would have been easier to leave, a father who lost a child and spent the rest of his life trying to help other children. Cool Hand Luke was a character who refused to break, who kept getting back up no matter how many times they knocked him down. Paul Newman lived that in his own way, not as a prisoner fighting guards, but as a man fighting his own demons, his own regrets, his own limitations. And in the end, he won more than he lost. Not perfect, not unblemished, but meaningful, real, human. If you enjoyed learning about Paul Newman's real life beyond the screen, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the icons who shaped our world.